Okay, so we're going to continue with interwoven timelines about Purim and the world of Shushan and the world of the other capital, Jerusalem. I want to address a question that you raised last week about sources outside of Tanakh that deal with it. And we're going to go into a little bit of detail. And before I get into it in detail, I'd actually like to do the summary, because the detail can be a little bit confusing, and the summary in some ways is better to begin with in this case, just to set a framework. Right? What I'm reading from right now is from a document written by Gil's student, who's a rabbi, and he summarized a lot of the external research that has been done on Megillas Esther. He asked the question, so when was Megillas Esther written? Right? In the view of Esther's setting in Shushan, it's a Persian background. It's the Ramesses and its lack of references to Palestine. There's a widespread agreement that Esther was composed in the Eastern diaspora, quite probably in Shushan itself. This is from a book called Persia and the Bible, written by a man named Yamauchi. Okay. Carrie Moore prefers to date Esther to the late Persian period, that is, in the early 4th century BC. Robert Gordis favors a similar date. Talman argues for a still earlier date. He concludes the traditional setting of the book of Esther in the days of Xerxes as Achashverosh, which was from 485 to 465 BCE, cannot be wide from the mark. And the author says, I agree with that position. Is the portrayal of Achashverosh believable? So the question, first of all, is really, who is Achashverosh? And there are two arguments about it. One is Cambyses, and the other is Xerxes. Right? The study of the Persian records indicates that Xerxes, as Achashverosh, was a more successful ruler than Herodotus would suggest. What we're going to get into later on is one of the issues with the confusion that exists of Persian history is most of Persian history until the last 50 years was based on Greek understanding of Persian history. Remember, the Greeks were conquered by the Persians, and Herodotus, who never was in Persia in his life, wrote most of the Persian history that we know today. Now, in the last 50 years, that's changed because a number of Persian documents have been discovered.
So he was in the same category as Josephus, right? Herodotus was the same.
Well, no, Herodotus was a Greek.
No, I said not by origin.
Herodotus really is viewed by many people as the father of historians. You know, he did a lot of research. Right. The question was how much of it was accurate, and it seems that much of it was not in terms of the Persians, right? Because the Persians' own description of the situation is sometimes quite different than that of Herodotus. But when I was growing up, right, my knowledge of Persian history, and I was fascinated by it at the time, was really all based on Herodotus, who I thought was kind of like a journalist. Right. But it seems that he wasn't at all. That he was very conscious of the political impact of what he was writing, and also that he had very little first-hand, probably much less, by the way, than Josephus. Very little first-hand knowledge, certainly of Persia.
So the Josephus was a bigger caliber, right?
What?
A historian, bigger caliber historian. The Joseph was considered as bigger caliber.
Oh no, Josephus had two things. Josephus was a higher caliber historian, yet he was more politically influenced than Herodotus. Okay. But he also had first-hand knowledge of much of what he wrote about in the wars, not about the whole history of the Jews. And by the way, he writes a lot about our story as well. We'll come to that later. But he also had first-hand knowledge of the victors of the war, that is to say, the Roman emperors. You know, and through the Roman emperors, if he wanted to interview a general, I guess they would cooperate. He did have the name Flavius attached to his name at that point. So it seems he had a lot of access to his most important stories, which was the destruction of the temple. But let's move on to let's stay with Herodotus for a second. So in here it says a study of Persian records, and this is only very new, in the last 50 years. Persian records indicates that Xerxes, Achashverosh, was far more successful ruler than Herodotus would suggest. Xerxes as Achashverosh used his fabulous wealth of his empire to build the most magnificent structure of Persian imperial times, the palace in Persepolis. He did, of course, also build one in Shushan, which is called Susa by the Persians, but that site is not as well preserved today. Xerxes' empire did extend from India to Ethiopia, right, which is the description that we have in the Megillah. Xerxes did have an architectural detail given in the palace. Xerxes Achashverosh had a winter palace in Shushan and had features not incompatible with the architectural detail of the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther describes the palace in detail at the beginning, right? And it's consistent with what we know from Persian records today. He was also famous for his lavish drinking parties and extravagant promises and gifts. Xerxes also had, on occasion, a nasty and irrational temper. So Xerxes seems to fit the character of Achashverosh. One of the places where he doesn't fit, you should have in mind, is this whole idea of him being a peasant. Right? It seems like he is of royal blood, as were all of the characters in the Persian.
That on?
What?
Based on why do they say they think he's from royal blood?
Because he's the son of the previous emperor.
Okay, but
that's why.
Okay,
right.
So he was
according to the Persian records. Now, by the way, the whole question of who Achashverosh was, much of this is medrash. That he was a stable boy. Vashti says, "You are like a stable boy. My father, could drink 1,000, the drinks of 1,000 men and never get drunk, and you're a foolish peasant who drinks wine, a glass of wine, and you act like an idiot, basically." Now that's really Medrash and Gemara. It's not in the Megillah, that description. The same is true with the role of Haman as a barber. So it's giving some color to it, but it's in the background. There are other views of these characters as well. Okay, does the book of Esther portray the Persian government properly? The author of Esther shows awareness of certain features of the Persian government, such as the 7 princely advisors, the very efficient postal system. He's also familiar with practices of Persian court life, including honor to the king's high officials, and the reading and rewarding of the king's benefactors. The author is also aware of various details of Persian customs, among them hanging as a form of capital punishment. And finally, the author uses a number of Persian nouns in the One of the most serious discrepancies cited by scholars to discredit the historicity of Esther is the fact that Herodotus indicates that Xerxes, Achashverosh's queen, was Amestris, right? Rather than the biblical Esther. We're going to come to this in more detail later. It's very interesting. J. Stafford Wright has suggested that by assuming certain phonetic modifications, an identification of Vashti with the Amestris can be made, a conclusion accepted by William Shea. Were all 127 provinces in Achashverosh's kingdom? I remember it's described as 127 provinces, right? Yeah. Leoz points out that the 23 satraps cover lesser divisions of up to 71 peoples and districts. That is to say, there were really 23 kingdoms within the empire that were ruled by either kings or governors that were appointed or existed and paid tribute to the Persian emperor. Within those nations, so to speak, right, there were subdivisions, right? And he points out that there was subdivisions of province for the 5th, 12th. They left out, in this calculation, left out the 5th, 12th, 13th satraps. The final total would be not far off 127 provinces ascribed to Xerxes, Achashverosh, and Esther 1.1. Using the same term, Medina, that was applied to Judea, in Persian Aramaic, Yehud, as the local district, as in Ezra 5.8 and Nehemiah 1.3. So it seems that the numbers agree, or close, to it. Is Mordechai a historical figure? Right? Now, this is one of the most interesting and provocative things in the book. Who was the first Jewish Mordechai? We know who the most important Jewish Mordechai was. Who was the
first Jewish?
Well,
by name.
Yeah,
the person by name Mordechai.
Yeah. Our Mordechai was the first Mordechai.
Who?
He wasn't named after somebody else.
No, yeah, okay. Oh, he was the first Mordechai.
He was all Mordechais later were named after this Mordechai.
Mordechai from that story about
There was
PURIM.
This PURIM story. Was the first.
That's the
He was the first. Right? Now, his name, which is very provocative, comes from Marduk.
From?
Marduk.
Marduk.
Marduk was a Babylonian god.
But Mordechai is not life.
The life of Marduk.
Yeah, it's just
Oh,
translation
really?
kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
But even Esther,
Marduk,
name,
Mordechai.
What?
Esther was Hadassah. She was named Esther after she became queen.
She was told to be called Esther when she was.
So that's after a goddess.
Also, right. That's right.
So maybe this is not his true name.
No, it seems that it is his true name, right? But he didn't choose his name, right? His parents chose his name. Right? So the question is asked: is this a sign of his assimilation into the Persian world?
Marduk.
His parents,
What?
maybe.
Marduk is assimilation.
That's right. That was,
because the Jewish
but that's
name,
Mordecai's name,
Yeah. No.
and it comes from that. It comes from Marduk. It doesn't come from anything else. It comes from this name.
So who introduced it as Mordechai?
What?
Who introduced it into the Megillah as Mordechai?
Who introduced it?
No,
His parents named him Mordechai after Marduk.
It could be that they give him Jews have Canadian names. Just it makes it easier if you have a name that fits in with the culture because.
Right. So it should trouble us all. Right? It should trouble us all.
Parents might not have been so
if my name were Bobby Joe, right, it would be less appropriate name for a Jew than David, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that Mordechai himself was in any way assimilated. We know from the story quite the opposite. He was a very proud Jew to be who he was. However, it was definitely a sign of the times that the Jews of Shushan were quite comfortable taking local names as part of their life process, that it was just easier to get along, right? And so his parents, maybe they called him Moshe at home, but his name was Mordechai.
From Israel?
What?
Did Mordechai came from Israel?
We're going to come to that soon.
Sorry.
But thank you from upstairs.
No, I was thinking the same thing, so
Right.
that's what to say.
Yeah. But remember, regardless of where you came from, right, Persia ran the world at that time. Okay?
Do you know what Mordechai? It can be from the Hebrew. If you take Mordechai, it's like two words. It's the root, Mem Reish Dalet. It's merit. It's revolution.
Interesting.
And Chai.
No, actually,
That's life.
The life of revolution. Interesting.
Revolution, the Mapicha.
No, Mordechai, it's merit. Merit, it's like goes against.
No.
Let's just continue from the outside sources for now. Okay, because I want to stay on topic.
Right.
Guys, I'd like to stay on topic here.
Okay.
Okay. The case for the historical identification of Mordechai with Marduka, attested as a royal Persian official, has been complicated by the publication, this is very interesting, of the Elamite tablets from Persepolis. We now have more than 30 texts dated from 505 to 499, it's our period, BCE, with the name Marduka Marduku, which may refer to 4 different individuals, although we cannot be certain. It is possible that one of these may have been our Mordechai, the biblical Mordechai. They were all officers of the crown, senior officers of the crown of Persia. In conclusion, Gordas summarizes the various lines in favor of the historicity of Esther by concluding, now, these are not Jews at all, right? By concluding, all in all, the case for the historical basis of the book is impressive. Moore admits, on the face of it, the history seems to be true. Nothing in the book seems improbable, let alone unbelievable. If this is the case, and if the alleged historical problems are not insoluble, then it would seem preferable to take the book at face value as a historical narrative rather than to resort to subjective and highly speculative reconstructions. Scholars such as Wright, Shea, Klaus, Schendel have indeed argued for such a view. Regarding the issue of the inclusion of Esther in the Bible, it goes on to another topic. Okay? So that's a kind of overall summary.
So it's not really confirmation, but just very probable, he said.
It's, well, 2 things. First of all, it's very probable, and there seems to be no contradiction in the process. So is there a confirmation in the sense of Esther, Hadassah, Mordechai, Haman, Achashverosh? It's definitely foggy. That's true, right? Are there characters and stories that are very consistent with our story that happened at that time? For sure there are. Right? So you might want to ask the question, is this a non-fiction novel? You could, in those terms, ask that question. I think as we look at it, you'll see that there's more and more consistency to it, or certainly it's very clear that the author of the Megillah doesn't want us to think this is a fanciful tale. You know, there's so much emphasis put on detail. You know, when this happened, when that happened, how many years into the reign this happened. You know, that it's a very difficult thing to see the author wanting us to see it as apocryphal. The author wants us to see it as definitely a factual event. There's no question. Right? Okay, so I want to go into a little bit more detail, and as we go further, we're going to get more and more into detail. So try and stay with me on this as we go forward, okay? Until the 19th century, 1800s, a search in secular sources for a Persian king named Achashverosh, or something close to that, would have been an unsuccessful one. Our knowledge of the Persian kings from the biblical period was coming entirely from the writings of Greek historians. None of the names that they recorded were close to Achashverosh. The Greek historians, Herodotus, especially 5th century BCE, which is very close to our time, and the others who came after him, described the following Persian kings from the biblical period: Cyrus, Koresh, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes. Those 5 are the ones that are described in Greek history about Persia. Yeah? We were thus left to speculate as to the identity of Achashverosh. Was he to be equated with Artaxerxes? This was the position taken by the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Esther. Was he to be equated with Cambyses? Or was he, as in Ezra 4:6, that is surrounding verses applied. The king between Darius the first and Artashasta, which is Artaxerxes the first. Okay? So, and that would be somebody who was called Xerxes by the Greeks. But why did the Greeks refer to him as Xerxes, a name at first glance seeming to have no relation to the name Achashverosh? Now let's just look. Ezra, right, is very, very detailed. You know, he's writing letters. So he seems to have copies of these letters going back and forth, right? And Ezra has this to say. In Ezra 4, verse 6, it says, "And in the reign of Achashverosh, at the beginning of his reign, they drafted an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem." Right. So we read this accusation before, right? But it's interesting because the letter that Ezra says is written to Achashverosh, the letter itself is written to King Artaxerxes. So it's like Ezra knows this king as Achashverosh, right? But the people writing a letter that's hostile to the Jews in Israel call the same king Artaxerxes. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Could one be a title, like, as opposed to the name?
Yes.
Like Pharaoh,
yeah.
Like Pharaoh or something.
That's right. That's right.
Like Caesar.
That's right. Absolutely. It could be. It could be. But it's clear from our source here, right, that Ezra is saying that during the reign of this person called Achashverosh, at the beginning of his reign, they drafted an accusation. Right? So the king who came before Achashverosh was Koresh, according to Ezra, right? The first king, in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, God's word was spoken by when God's word was spoken by Yirmiyahu was fulfilled. God roused the spirit of King Koresh of Persia, Cyrus, to issue throughout his kingdom the following proclamation bearing his seal. And this is very important, right?
Cyrus, I remember.
He said, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, God, the Lord of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and instructed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the house of God, Lord of Israel, the God who dwells in Jerusalem. And as for anyone who remains behind, wherever he may live, let the people of his district support him with silver and gold, and with goods and livestock, in addition to freewill offerings for God's temple in Jerusalem." Simply, it says that God has spoken to me, Cyrus, and I want the Jews to go home to build the temple. Right? I want to be responsible for the fact that they went home. They're going to build a temple in Jerusalem to the God of Israel, right? And by the way, some of your neighbors are poor Jews. And those poor Jews, you should finance their trip home. The wealthy in your neighborhood, right? If a Jew can't get back to Israel and wants to go, then a Persian should pay for it. And they did. In very large numbers, the Persians themselves financed the Jewish return. What is unfortunate was, according to Ezra, later on we see, the sum, and he lists in detail every family. It's like 2 pages long. Every family and how many people of every family went back home with Zerubbabel. The sum of the entire congregation was 42,360 people, not including their male and female servants, those being another 7,337. They also had 200 male and female singers, 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. Okay? And he has more and more detail. I won't go through all of it.
The whole report.
And the people assembled, and he uses a very interesting phrase, which I think echoes in our minds. That when the 7th month, Tishrei, had come, the Israelites were settled in the cities. The people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Anybody? Does that remind anybody of another phrase?
Like Mount Sinai.
Mount Sinai. They stood as one man, one soul, one man.
Matan Torah.
Yeah. And the story goes on. And then we come to, they began the building, right? Koresh, I think, only ruled for a very short time, like 3 or 4 years, right? Mm-hmm. They'd begun the building, right? And what do you know? This letter is written to Koresh's successor, who is Achashverosh, according to Ezra, right? Ezra says, and in the reign of Achashverosh, at the beginning of his reign, they, meaning all the people who hated the Jews that were living there, you have to remember that people were brought to Sennacherib, who was the Assyrian conqueror of Israel, depopulated the northern tribes, the 10 tribes, and then later Nebuchadnezzar took the final 2 tribes of the southern kingdom. But they didn't leave the land empty. One of the techniques of Sennacherib was that he mixed populations. So he sent the Chechens, right? You know, he moved other nations from their territory into the territory of Israel, right? He depopulated Israel and then filled it with others, like Karaites, like Samaritans, people like that, who were, in a sense, counterfeit Israelites at that point. And their love of the Israelites was not unlike the love that refugees show for one another today. You know, very often we see that certain refugees that are not very welcome among other refugees get pushed into the sea after their passports are removed. And so when the 42,000 Jews were coming home, they were not greeted with open arms at all. You know, I remember, you know, about 5 years ago, we returned to my wife's home in Odessa, literally to her home,
right,
to where she lived. And when
still standing there?
When we arrived there with her and her sister, the woman who was her neighbor, but apparently was now living in the apartment she lived in Odessa, came to greet us very nervously. Very nervously.
That you are coming to,
and she said, I heard you were in Canada. This was all translated to me later.
Right.
Elena said, yes, we are. And she said, is life good in Canada? Elena said, yes, it is. Right. And then reassured her that we had no intention of moving back into that apartment.
Right.
But there was a very, very tense moment.
Of course.
Yeah.
You know, that she had gotten a phone call from her son, who was living in their old apartment, which was next door to Mom's new apartment, that we had returned. Right? They were recognizable, I guess. So, you know, Elena was full grown when she left. Selena was much younger. So they recognized us. You know, it was very interesting. So the return of the initial populace is not always greeted favorably by the replaced populace, right? And so it was here.
That's what's happening in Crimea when Tatars are returning back.
Yeah.
Who were repopulated or removed from Crimea by Stalin, and they are coming and coming.
Yeah, that's right.
The Ukrainians are there.
So these people wrote a very nasty letter to an emperor called Achashverosh. Right? This is Ezra's description. Ezra's description is that they wrote a letter. But then he actually quotes the written letter. Right? He seems somehow to have gotten a copy of it. I don't know how. Right? It's not clear. Right? But it says here, they're not writing a letter to Achashverosh. They're writing a letter to King Artaxerxes. your servants, men of the provinces beyond the Euphrates River. Right? So they know him as Artaxerxes, and you may be right. It may be that Artaxerxes is a royal title. But Herodotus considers Artaxerxes one of a chain of 5. That there's a Xerxes, and Artaxerxes, Cambyses, Koresh, etc. Yeah? And so in Ezra, Ezra seems to be very clear that those two are the same people, right? Because he says the letter was written to Achashverosh, and they write a letter to Artaxerxes. At the end, there's a plea made, right? Another letter is written, skipping to the end of the story, right? Where, who is behind this letter? By the way, when the Jews are told to stop building, they don't, right? When Achashverosh has stopped building, they quietly continue. When they start, it's a very big deal, right? And they continue to, long before the temple is built, on the Temple Mount, they're actually bringing daily offerings there, right? And holiday offerings there. The first thing they seem to build is the Mizbeach, right? And they start bringing offerings as soon as they can.
Can I ask you a question? When you mentioned about the names of Achashverosh and Xerxes, that if it's just to confirm, to prove that it's the same person, but in documentation and everything in the writings, it appears that more or less in the same period of time.
It's definitely the same period of time.
Okay.
You know,
that's why I said just.
You know, the problem is when you're looking back 2,500 years, 50 and 75 years is not a very big period of time, right? Yeah. So it's one of the problems of looking for, you know, which Bush was it that was the 41st president? You know, it's that kind of question. You know, there were two. There were within 100 years 2 President Johnsons, both who became president after the assassination of the previous presidents, Lincoln and Kennedy. Right. They were succeeded by their vice presidents, who were President Johnson. You could imagine how people would see this 2,500 years later. It could be very confusing.
Right? We are well zoomed out of that era, so we are, and to zoom in, but we need to have a lot of information.
We have to be zooming in because the description of Megillas Esther has 2 forms, right? One is that it's a Megillah, a revelation, right, of something hidden. Megillah is a revelation. Esther Panim is hidden, right? Exactly. But the other is, and you'll notice when you watch the Megillah being read, unlike the Torah, which is done this way, right? The Megillah is taken out of its case, right? And then it's the people setting it up, right, will take it like this, and like this, and like this, and like this. Why are they doing it, right? Why don't they just roll it from one side to the other? Because it's considered a letter to the Jewish people
so that Esther wrote. Read it as a letter, not as a scroll.
So from Esther's point of view, and this tradition that we have of doing it this way, which is all over the world, it's not, and it's quite awkward, actually. The idea is that it's the news of the day. So we're reading the news of the day 2,500 years later, right? Which means that all of the things that I'm kind of hinting at, right, would have been clearly understood by everybody living at the time, right? It's just that when we look at the news of the day, you know, I showed you that thing a couple of weeks ago of the kind of New York Times view of Jewish history, right? And it's very charming, kind of fun, right? But in fact, a great deal of what we read, right, is exactly that way. It's a recount of events, with one exception. You know, many years ago, I had to meet with somebody who was the first minister of the Soviet mission to the UN. And he said to me, I'll meet you at the delegates' lounge at the UN. Right? We had never seen each other, right? And there was no Google at the time. And he said, do you know what Pravda is? I said, kind of. Pravda. I said, it's a publication. He said, I'll have a copy of Pravda tucked under my left arm.
KGB sign.
And then he repeated, he said, under my left arm. Right? So, he was telling me something too. Who he was. If he's identifying that, he could have said, I'm sitting on the table on the left on the corner. Right? But how he met people for the last 30 years was this way. Right? So I understood when I was going to meet him that I was meeting a first minister of the embassy who was also an intelligence officer. Right? It was clear. And he wanted me to know that. It wasn't...
that was on purpose.
Absolutely. He knew who I was at the time. I was making films about the Soviets and defectors at the time. So it was like an exchange of information. Right? So all of those subtleties, if you read that in the history of my life, 2,500 years later, you would have said, David Ostriker met a minister of the Russian embassy, right? And he was carrying a newspaper, right? But as I tell you the story, I didn't finish the story, and you ended it, right? Because it's so clear to you, right? That's what we're looking at in the story of Esther, right? The story of Esther has all of those things placed into it, right? As does much of Jewish history, but we don't see it that way. Because we see it as, and it's very important, as a religious document, as a spiritual document, as a document of lessons for our lives, right? We actually don't see the thing that's right in front of us, which would have been the news of the day for the people. And lest you, here's an amazing thing, lest you question it, let me read you the end of the book of Esther. It's an amazing thing, right? The end of the book of Esther tells you, I'm actually reading, I think, is it? Yeah, it's the first sentence in chapter 10, the last chapter. King Achashverosh imposed a tax on the mainland and on the offshore islands. All his powerful and mighty acts, and an account of his preeminence to which the king raised Mordecai, are undoubtedly written in the history books of the kings of Media and Persia. The Megillah is saying, you want confirmation of the story? Go to those books, right? You won't see this.
They haven't found those books, have they?
They're finding them, actually. They've recently made some discoveries. But much of Persian history of this time was destroyed, it seems. And also a lot of it may not have been maintained. That this was not the strength. Persia had some strengths. The Babylonians had much greater strengths in terms of history, much more detail. Anyway, so in the end, by the way, they come back and they write a letter to Darius, to Darius, right? In which they say they make this argument to Darius. This is in Ezra, right? They say to him, you should know, right, that your grandfather, Cyrus, Koresh, right, sent us back here to build the temple, right? Search through the archives, right, and you'll find a reference, an official reference to that, right? It says, thereupon King Darius issued an order to search the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon, but it was in the province of Media that a scroll encased in a canister was found, upon which the following was written. A memorandum, right? A memorandum. In the first year of King Cyrus, Koresh, King Cyrus issued an order concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt and the place where they offered sacrifices, let its foundations be strengthened. And then it describes in detail, it shall be 60 cubits by 60 cubits, right? And so Darius wrote a letter to the enemies of the Jews, right, in Jerusalem, right? Allow the work of the temple of God to continue. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild the temple of God on its site. Furthermore, I hereby issue an order outlining what you must do to assist these elders of the Jews in rebuilding the temple of God. The expenses are to be swiftly paid to these men out of the king's resources, taken from the taxes of the province beyond the river, so that the work will not be interrupted. Right? And so, and then
generous.
Yeah. Right. Now we hold that he's the son of Esther. Right? That he was a Jewish king. Right? Okay. So let's proceed with that. A little bit more background. Things coming together a little bit. Okay. All right. Okay. So it was in. Okay. So it was only in the night. Some of this is a little bit of a repeat of the summary that I gave you before, but it'll fall together. It was only in the 19th century, as a result of the decipherment of old Persian cuneiform inscriptions from the ancient Persian palaces, they were able to answer these questions. It was discovered that the name of the king that the Greeks had been referring to as Xerxes was in fact, be patient with me, I will try and pronounce this for you, Achashverosh, written in Old Persian cuneiform. This name is actually very close to Achashverosh. In their consonantal structure, that is to say, the consonants of the names are very similar. The vowels seem to be different, but of course vowels were not written in it, right? So there's a question, right? He goes into detail explaining how they resemble each other, right? And then he points out that the real problem with the similarity of the names is Achashverosh has vavs in it, right? Yeah. And the other name does not. Right. Sometimes it has Achashverosh's name has two vavs, sometimes it has one.
You know, it's like someone saying the name Yitzchak, and then they're calling him Isaac.
Right.
Like, I mean, depending on what, how you're referring, it sounds a lot different, but
yeah,
and it's written
Jeremiah and Yirmiyahu.
And Yirmiyahu.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. So, but now listen to this, right? In the Megillah, the name Achashverosh appears many times with only one vav, and in verse 10, chapter 10, verse 1, which we just read, spells the name with no vavs at all. Achashverosh. There's no veros. No vav. Right? Thereafter, at the beginning of the 20th century, Aramaic documents from Egypt, the 5th century BC, came to light. These documents, which are in Aramaic, make clear that it's the same name, Achashverosh.
That probably maybe was the reason was that it was illiterate people or something like the grammatical.
There's different languages. It was just different languages.
Different languages.
My wife's name, is, what is it? Yelena, Elaine. There's so many different names that people are not familiar. Helen, right? Yenta. People are not familiar. Yenta, right? Yeah. All those names, right? Yenta Tova, right? But they're all those names. Sound right. That's but because it means better. Gentile, by the way. Shalom Aleichem changed the meaning of it. Yeah. But it's a Yiddish word for gentile.
Really?
Yeah. That's where it comes from. Yeah. Which is appropriate.
Gentile was the more like the explanation.
The name Yenta fell into disrepute purely because of Shalom Aleichem. That's not what a Yenta was. A Yenta was a refined woman. Before Shalom Aleichem, he changed our understanding of it.
Because it was like in people's name.
It's because he was a playwright who was very successful. That's why.
But the meaning was different. Yenta. The one which schmoozes and talking and this and that.
You're missing my point. You're missing it, right? A Yenta was a genteel woman, a refined woman. Shalom Aleichem,
I understand.
Created character who was a gossipy, talky person and gave her that name.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's what it became.
From that, we got this term. Exactly. But that's not what the Yiddish term Yenta means.
I understood what you were talking.
Just wanted to clarify.
No. I got it.
It is the power of the media.
Yes.
It's the power of the media.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So we have an inscription of this name in Persian which lists the countries over which he ruled. Among the countries listed are Hidush and Kushia. right? Hindus and Kush, from India to Kush, right? Most likely Hodu to Kush, right? Which is the description in the Megillah, right? Of the empire of Achashverosh, right? So this author strongly holds it's Xerxes, you know, who is Achashverosh, right? At this point, right? Artaxerxes is a title. And it seems Artaxerxes, in fact, whoever said that earlier, was right, is that Artaxerxes was the title for the emperor. It means long hand in Persian, a long hand, right? The emperor has a long hand. We know this expression. It's a sign of great power, right? It's the long-handed one, right, in Persian. Right? According to Herodotus, Xerxes was the son of Darius.
Yes.
And
Darius was his.
This is a conflicting view. Okay, hang on. And according to this, if he was that Xerxes, right, the temple would have been rebuilt because he came after Darius, right? Darius rebuilt the temple. So Xerxes came after Darius. He's a late Xerxes for us because our Xerxes stopped the building of the temple, right? Remember?
There's a theory there was two Darius.
There's Darius the first, Darius the second, and Darius the third. There's actually three, right? But the first Darius doesn't seem to be mentioned in our story, right?
He didn't last long.
Right. To get a little bit of perspective, the party in which Vashti rebelled took place in the 3rd year of the reign of Achashverosh. This is by our accounting. Esther was not chosen until the 7th year. Right? It's a very long story, actually. Right?
Yeah.
Why did it take Achashverosh so long to choose a replacement? You know, you would think that he was kind of lonely. You know, it's a long time before he had a proper queen, right? It seems that Xerxes, if it was Xerxes, our Xerxes, right, was involved in a full-scale war and invasion of Greece at the time. And Xerxes, according to Persian records, went on the battle himself. And he was gone for 3 years. Right.
David, you mentioned that so the long period of time, it means the replacement of Vashti took a number of years?
4 years.
4 years. That's
4
what I
years.
said.
Yeah,
You mentioned
right.
3 and 4 and 7.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so we have a record of a solar eclipse that takes place during the battles in Greece, right? And it can be calculated that Xerxes did not return to Shushan until the fall of 479 BCE, in the 7th year of the reign of Achashverosh. Right? Okay, so now it's coming back into when Esther was chosen. So he came back, and she was chosen really probably within 6 months of the time he returned. Right?
Disagree with you from upstairs?
No,
No,
not
you
from
can't.
upstairs.
You're not the part of the class.
Yeah.
The voice from
Don't punish
heaven.
him. Don't punish
From
him
above.
harshly.
Okay, next question. Do we have any evidence in the secular sources for the main part of the Purim story, the threat to destroy the Jews in the 12th year of the reign? We do not.
So, Esther was chosen in the 7th year, and the plot
5 years later.
plot was in the 12th.
Yeah. The
But
plan...
I thought that it was the reverse. Or no, well, no, okay. No, she was already well established.
Remember,
then.
Mordecai
She's
says,
well
maybe
established.
this is why you got this job.
Okay, so yeah, so
Right?
she was in. So she was already there for 5 years, roughly.
That's right.
Roughly, yeah. That's
Okay.
correct. That's right, 5 years. Right? We do not. But this is to be expected. No works from any Persian historians from this period has survived. It may be that no such works were ever composed, but they certainly haven't been found. Our main source for the events of the reign of Xerxes is Herodotus, and his narrative ends in the 7th year. Okay? So Herodotus does not continue past the rise of Esther, or actually the end of the war in Greece, right? Which makes a certain amount of sense, considering he was Greek. Interestingly, there is perhaps a reference to Mordecai in a later narrative source. The Greek historian Cestus, who served as physician to Artaxerxes II, mentions Amatakas, who was the most influential of all of Xerxes' ministers. Malakas suggests a Persian name with the consonants of MTC, which would be very close to the consonants of the name Mordecai, MRDC. The information provided, because you remember we're working really with consonants, and we're filling in vowels always. Right? The information provided by Cestus bears a significant resemblance to the last verse in Megillah, which records that by the end of the story, Mordecai was Mishneh, the second to the king. The most interesting is what happens when we analyze the secular sources regarding the wife of Xerxes. Right? Remember we talked about this earlier, right? According to Herodotus, Xerxes' wife was named Amestris. 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 Right? And she was the daughter of a military commander named Otanes. In the Megillah, Esther is described as the daughter of Avichail. Cestus records that Amestris outlived Xerxes. Moreover, in further detail, Cestus provides Amestris is involved in the royal affairs even in the reign of her son, Artaxerxes. Right? Okay.
So maybe they gave her a Persian name, another name maybe.
Neither Herodotus nor Cestus used the term like queen for her, but her description fits what we would call today a queen. She was very involved with royal activities. Right? Some postulate that she was Vashti, but this is extremely unlikely since there is nothing in Herodotus or Cestus to indicate any loss of status of Amestris. Right? Vashti either was killed or exiled. So it's not clear. Right? Others postulate that Esther was never the main wife of Xerxes, but was one of the other wives of a lesser status. The problem with this approach is the clear impression that one receives from the Megillah is that Esther was the Persian wife of the highest status from the time she was chosen in the 7th year of the reign of Achashverosh through the balance of the years described in the book. Right?
Plus her son became king, which would mean...
What?
And if her son became the king after the father,
right.
that would imply that she would have to be the main wife.
Right, and that's right. That's a very good point. Right.
That is
yeah.
First.
Not the first.
The second?
Maybe third. There's three.
Okay. Could it be that Herodotus simply erred regarding her ancestry? Although Herodotus traveled widely during the years from 460s and 450s, he probably never set foot in Persia. His information about Persia is based on what was told to him orally. Every scholar knows that he could not possibly be correct on a large percentage of the details of his reports, whether about Persia or any other matter. Also, the impression that one receives from the Megillah is that Esther did not disclose her true ancestry for several years. Whatever rumors about her ancestry first came out may be what made their way to Herodotus. Now remember, Herodotus actually stopped writing about this story very soon after she became queen, if not even before. Right? It's striking that the name Avichail means military commander. It is not so far-fetched to suggest that Avichail might have had another name which resembled the name Otanes. The Megillah tells us that Esther had another name, Hadassah. Herodotus tells a story depicting the cruelty of Amestris. She was very cruel. Right? Amestris takes revenge on a woman by cutting off her body parts and throwing them to the dogs.
Who was cruel?
This is Herodotus writing.
So who was cruel?
Amestris, who our author says may be Esther, right? Others say she could be Vashti. She sounds a lot more like Vashti so far, right? And she was very tough. Very tough. Although he never says it explicitly, one gets the impression from Herodotus that he believed Amestris was the wife of Xerxes even in the first 7 years of Xerxes' reign. But it would be understandable that Herodotus might have had such a belief according to the Megillah. Vashti was gone by the 3rd year of Xerxes. Xerxes reigned 18 years after that. To Herodotus and his informants, Vashti may have been long forgotten by this time. Okay? So we have no Persian sources for the name of the wife of Ahasuerus, who we're saying is Achashverosh, and who the Greeks call Xerxes. But close examination of the name Amestris supports the identification with Esther. The IS at the end of the name, right, is a suffix that was
Greekish.
What?
Sounds very Greekish.
To turn a foreign name into a proper Greek grammatical form. Well said. Right?
Yeah, IS is Greek.
Right. Just as S was also added to the name Xerx.
But you know, Esther did
Xerxes.
have this little quality when they asked what would you after the first day of the fighting back.
Right.
They said, "What would you like?" She goes, "Well, I want the sons I haven't hanged, another day of killing in Shushan." You know, but maybe she had this little streak in her.
Oh, she recognizes an enemy.
Right.
Yeah.
So
That's
it's
right.
conceivable.
Right.
Like, you know,
Right.
like, we don't know for sure, but...
So he goes on to say, if you take out the is, right, you have Esther at that point, right? Okay, coming to the end of this one, right? So now here's a very interesting reading he has, because remember, in ancient texts there's no punctuation, right? And he has a problem, right? And his problem is this with our Mordecai. It seems, right, once we realize that Achashverosh is Xerxes, it becomes evident that the Asher Hagwa, the how do we translate that? The Hagola Asher is the one who is exiled. Could it be? Yeah, exiled along with the group that was exiled. Right. So once we realize that Achashverosh is Xerxes, it becomes evident that the Asher Hagla of Esther 6:2 cannot be referring to our Mordecai. Right? Now, this verse is a very famous verse, right? We read it out loud, right? Ish Yehudi, Haya B'Shushan, Habira, right? Okay. There was a Jewish man in Shushan, the capital, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish the Benjaminite, right? Who had been exiled from Jerusalem along with the group that was exiled with King Yechoniah, king of Judah, right? Which the king Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had driven into exile. Famous line. Right? Let's try reading it with a slightly different punctuation, right? Because if this is true, Mordecai is way over 120 years old at the time of the Esther story.
Because it says son of Kish.
And Esther also is, this old lady that we talked about before.
It said son of Kish. That would have made him like the brother of Shaul.
So I want to try reading this with a slightly different punctuation, because remember, the Megillah has no formal punctuation. Right? There was a Jewish man in Shushan, the capital, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shmi, the son of Kish, a Benjamite who had been exiled from Jerusalem along with the group that was exiled. So that puts a different twist on it. He's actually the grandson, right, of the person who's exiled from Jerusalem, is what we're saying, right? He wasn't exiled from Jerusalem. It depends on where you put the comma and where you put the period.
Makes him much younger.
Right. Makes him much, and Esther much younger as well.
Because that makes sense, because when he returned, his name's in the records of the return from Babylon, right?
Yes.
So, because he would be very old returning.
Actually, we'll come to this in a second, okay?
You could not have children at the son Darius and whatever, so she could not.
Sarah had children at 9.
Did every woman have blessing from
The identification of Achashverosh with Xerxes does not fit with the view of the Talmud. Okay? According to the Talmud, Megillah 11b, based on Seder Olam, Megillah 11b, in the view of the Seder Olam and the Talmud, the Persian period spanned the reigns of 3 Persian kings. This is much shorter than the conventional chronology. The conventional chronology is set forth in the table below, and he has the list here. Okay. The king intended to be depicted in the Megillah was Xerxes, accepted by legions of scholars today, even if they question the historicity of the story. With orthodoxy, some sources that accept the identification of Achashverosh with Xerxes include Chamas Megillah, Reb Yitzchak Halevi, Reb Shlomo Danziger, Reb Avigdor Miller, Adin Steinsaltz, Reb Yoel ben Nun, Reb Yehuda Landi, and Rabbi Menachem Liebtag. The Megillah implied that we should search outside the Bible for additional information regarding Achashverosh, which I read you earlier. Okay. So this doesn't really bring us to where I wanted to get today, but I think that our heads should be spinning enough by this complexity. Right?
It is.
Okay, good. That's not a bad thing, as we sort it out.
Yeah, we are in the process of
I think we've gone to some extent to answer some of the questions you raised earlier about other sources. We don't have the confirmation in the sense that you're looking for it, but clearly one of the important things to remember is that the wife of Xerxes was A, very involved with court activities, B, outlived him, and C, was the queen mother of Artaxerxes during his reign. Right? Now this is fairly consistent with some of the things we understand, right? For instance, Achashverosh married a woman who he did not really know who she was. He wasn't looking for a royal counterpart. He'd had enough of that with Vashti, right? And then, in the end, he finds out, yes, he has a wife who is related to the first king of Israel, Shaul.
For Esther?
And, Esther. And not only that, the turning point in the whole story of Purim, is when Esther, and the term that's used is, she dons her royal garments. Throughout the first half of the story, she's very plain, very beautiful, but she's not wearing a lot of jewels and crowns, and it's clear that she's actually wants to be very low key. When she agrees with Mordecai to go see the emperor, there's a whole series of events that happens, one of which is she becomes the empress. She determines now, live or die, I can no longer be low key, I will be the empress. She goes to Achashverosh, she touches, he lowers the scepter, says, whatever you want, my queen. It's a turning point. And from there on in, if you watch this drama, you'll see that Esther, who has been this quiet sort of background person, is now controlling every event that happens.
In fact,
every moment, every event at this point.
I remember studying the tractate Megillah with Rabbi Rand, and you'll find out that Esther was no Like, she wasn't a pretty face. She was very manipulative. She set the whole stage for Haman. She set the stage to getting the king actually jealous of Haman. She manipulated even the king and Haman's servants to make them think that she was with them, so they would betray him. She was very intelligent.
In fact, she shocks Haman.
She was a pretty face.
In fact,
she was a pretty face. She was very intelligent.
In fact, she shocks Haman. She says to the king,
Haman tried to follow her, and Achashverosh.
In fact, she surprises Haman completely. Because she says to the king, he wants to kill me.
Right.
Haman's going, what?
Yeah.
I got nothing against the queen, right? In fact, I had a lot to do with the fact she's the queen. What's she talking about? I'm Jewish. He wants to kill all the Jews, including me. Right? It's like a shocking moment if you see it from a slightly different perspective. And she's set the whole thing up. Anyway, my point is that this woman, who we see is the wife of Xerxes, right, is somebody who has that involvement. Our Achashverosh dies a couple of years after the Purim story ends. His son, Daryovesh II, right, becomes the emperor, continues, as we read in Ezra, continues the rebuilding of the temple, orders support for the rebuilding of the temple, right, acknowledges that the crown wants the temple to be rebuilt, right, and all this time, his mother is alive as well, right? So the Esther of the story is consistent in many ways, right? Although she's not named Esther, as we call her, right? But Esther, by the way, again, it's not a Jewish name any more than Mordechai is, right? Her name is Hadassah, right? Esther means hidden.
Hidden, yeah, Hester Panim.
Hester Panim, right? Esther means hidden. And we'll continue unhiding things next week.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Very
Thank you.
good.